welcome to Daily Debrief brought to you by People's Dispatch. I'm Pragya and today we talk about Peruvian President Pedro Castillo's challenges, India opening government-level talks with the Taliban in Afghanistan, and a growing India-Israel partnership that focuses on defense technologies. On May 30, Peruvian President Pedro Castillo announced a bill to eliminate immunity for high-ranking state officials. He called it a step to promote transparency, and it comes just one day after the National Prosecutor's Office opened an investigation against him. Many see the latest investigation as politically motivated. For in less than 1 year, Castillo and his Free Peru government have regularly faced impeachment motions and other legal attacks. The right-wing opposition Popular Renewal Party moved a motion in March which collapsed. The Constitution of Peru protects the president from all accusations of wrongdoing except treason. Most high-ranking official positions have similar immunity. We'll go to Zoe from People's Dispatch for more details on this.
Zoe, could you start by first talking about the bill announced by Castillo and the context of the campaign against him?
Yeah, definitely. So on May 30th, the Peruvian president, Pedro Castillo, announced that he would present a bill that would essentially eliminate immunity for all high-ranking state officials. And he said that this was in order to promote transparency in the government. The head of state and media announced this during a meeting in the Loreto region. And it's quite interesting that this comes up because Castillo and members of his government have been facing a very intense lawfare campaign in which the far right has attempted to accuse them of different acts of corruption and other allegations. What's interesting is that, of course, these same far-right politicians have themselves also been accused of these crimes. So it's considered to be quite groundbreaking that that Pedro Castillo, as head of state, seeks to eliminate this immunity because many former heads of state have enjoyed this immunity. Many members of the Peruvian government have been accused of corruption, have been accused of other crimes, and oftentimes not really faced any real charges from this. Keiko Fujimori, who was running off against Pedro Castillo last year, one of the big expectations of these elections was that Keiko herself, who was facing many different corruption charges, if she won, she wouldn't have to face prosecution. And many expected that once Pedro Castillo won, that it would kind of be game over for her, given how many charges she's facing. This, of course, still hasn't happened despite not being head of state, despite not having immunity. She has, in a sense, political immunity. But it really is an interesting development. There is, of course, a very big challenge in front of leaders across the world of how to tackle the corruption of people who are in government, who do have this immunity, who sometimes abuse of this immunity, oftentimes more than not. We can look at, across the continent, the case of Honduran President Juan Orlando Hernandez, who up until once he was out of office, he actually was extradited to the United States. But the 8 years that he was in office, he was committing crimes. He was involved in drug trafficking cases. And it was only once he was out of office that he even really faced some level of justice for the crimes that he committed.
Right. Ever since he came to power, actually, there's been like this concerted campaign against him. Why is there so much hostility, and is it politics as usual?
That's a great question. And I think it's interesting to see that despite all of the hostility against him, Pedro Castillo continues to attempt to take on those in power. He continues to present measures like this one to eliminate immunity for all of his enemies. And this is really interesting. And since, as you mentioned, even before he was sworn into office, there has been a very, very strong campaign against Pedro Castillo. It's essentially been a scenario of ungovernability. He has not been able to do as many things as he wanted to do. They have been attacking him, his ministers. He's had to reform the cabinet of his government over 4 times. There has been, as I mentioned before, allegations of corruption, the media getting involved, using all of any means necessary to really vilify him, using non-political terms, just going after his family, going after all of the people in his government. And it's really shown the ability of the right wing to use all measures necessary, the judiciary, the media, all of these spheres of dominance that they still have to attack a left-wing and progressive leader. And it really shows, unfortunately, the limits that one has, even in the executive branch, to really make transformative change in a country and in a system that's still dominated by those with power and by those with money.
All right, Zoe, thanks for that update very much.
Thanks so much for having me.
9 months after the Taliban came to power in Afghanistan, an official Indian delegation held talks with Foreign Minister Amir Khan Muttaqi. The Indian mission had emptied out, citing the security situation in Afghanistan last year in August. India sent J.P. Singh, a joint secretary in the Foreign Ministry, to Afghanistan. Afghanistan is understood to have asked India to resume stalled projects. India also plans humanitarian assistance for the country, which faces a fragile economic situation. We'll go to Abdul from People's Dispatch to talk about this. So, Abdul, India hasn't recognized the Taliban government, and many people said that India has actually missed the bus on discussions with the Taliban. So, what seems to be the strategy now?
I think they are trying to develop a working rapport with Taliban at this moment. As you rightly pointed out, earlier when the Taliban took over, India abandoned its mission in Afghanistan. It abandoned its investments, which was huge. And given the strategical importance of Afghanistan, that was later on realized that it is a mistake. Also, given the fact that Afghanistan, despite the fact that Taliban came to power, the other countries have not stopped engaging with that. It means in that situation, Indian government realized that what they did, following the US blindly at that moment, because if US disengaged with Taliban, you also disengage, there is a difference. Afghanistan is not a US neighborhood, but India, it is your neighbor.
Right.
So that realization has become strong, and therefore they are trying to correct a mistake which they did earlier. So this is not the first time that India is engaging with Taliban. There was an humanitarian aid delivered to Afghanistan few months back during the winter when Afghanistan was facing a huge, that crisis is still going on, but they were facing a huge lack of basic food and other amenities. So India did provide through Pakistan by road, provided grain and other things, medicine and grain, vaccines, COVID vaccines and all those things. So I think this is an attempt at this moment to kind of keep that momentum going, and eventually, of course, to kind of have some ways to revive whatever India was doing before the in Afghanistan before Taliban came to power.
All right. Now, the other countries, can you tell us about what kind of relationships they have struck with the Taliban?
See, in the region, if you see, there are many ways to look at it, the other countries' engagement with Afghanistan. We know that Pakistan is one of the main backers of Taliban government in Afghanistan, and apart from that, the other countries, particularly Iran and China, have very aggressively engaged with Taliban after the withdrawal of US forces from the country. Given the fact that it is a strategic country, not only in terms of having some kind of economic understanding, economic investment and economic relationship, but also for strategic reasons. That is the route towards to Central Asia, physical route to Europe for China, and Iran was also Iran has a longer cultural and historical relationship with Afghanistan. Given the fact that there is a big border which it shares with Afghanistan, and there are migrants, refugees in Iran, Afghan refugees in Iran. So of course Iran has no other option but to kind of develop maintain the relationship with Taliban government. One more thing, there are how to put it? There are a set of countries in the region, particularly the Central Asian countries, which had problems with the government which was there before, the Ashraf Ghani government, the pro-US government there, and since that government has left, that it seems that there is a welcoming change in Afghanistan, despite the fact that there is ideological differences, despite the fact there is a hesitancy to recognize Taliban given the history Taliban had, and all those things. But these countries have understood that given the fact that Afghanistan is an important country in the region, we cannot leave it as it is. Apart from that, there are all the countries, including the US, has been engaging with Taliban on the humanitarian basis.
Right.
European Union, Russia, they all have been providing humanitarian aid to Taliban government in Afghanistan, because even if you have differences with the government at this moment, you can't leave the people, the millions of Afghans, at the mercy of their regime which you do not recognize. And therefore, these countries have started developing that relationship, and India has learned, it seems, from those engagements, particularly the engagement of China in Afghanistan has kind of, you can say, has kind of given a boost to India's, among the Indian diplomats, and there is a requirement to kind of develop working relationship, at least at this moment, with Taliban.
All right, Abdul, this is a story worth watching, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Benny Gantz visited India on 2nd June and has signed a defense deal that talks about sharing futuristic defense technologies. The two countries discussed joint research and development and strategic global challenges in a meeting between Israeli and Indian defense minister. According to a statement from the Indian government, they discussed military training as well, and FTA is also on the cards. Various working groups and other defense-related partnerships are in the works between India and Israel. India has been talking about drone technologies in which Israel might emerge a partner. We return to Abdul on the significance of this visit. Abdul, India and Israel are talking about defense partnership. It's as if the Pegasus scandal never broke.
Of course, because they do not have such moral problems when it comes to defense ties. India is one of the largest weapon buyer of Israel, and also because of the ideological inclinations between, you can say, closeness between the government in India at this moment and the Israeli Zionist regime. Issues like Pegasus do not make much effect when it comes to closening, deepening the relationship. We know that the Israeli governments, not now, in fact, for last 30 years, this is the 30th year since they established formal diplomatic relations, both the countries. Israeli government, particularly post-1990s, has shifted towards right as much as possible, as much as we can imagine.
Right.
And today, Indian government is a definition of the right-wing ideology. Correct. So there is a closeness behind that. Apart from that, there are also security engagements between both the countries, which are quite, they are going on for quite long time. As I said, that India is one of the main buyers of Israeli weapons. Apart from that, there are collaborations between Indian and American Indian and Israeli companies. They are co-developing and co-producing weapons in India. And then there are, as you rightly pointed out during your presentation, that how they are talking about military ties, deepening of the military ties, given the fact that Indian government thinks that the way Israel is handling with its Palestinian issue, that is a lesson for them to handle their own issues in Kashmir and in other parts of the country. So the way Israel is dealing with Palestinian nationals hood is basically a lesson learned by the Indian government to deal with the dissent in this country. So Pegasus should be seen in that context. Indian government has used it, has not even denied formally that they have bought it, and therefore all the issues raised by the human rights groups or the democratic forces do not make much difference. As we know that throughout the world at this moment, Israel is gradually being kind of sidelined, identified as an apartheid state, that it discriminates against its Palestinian population and also discriminates against the occupied people in occupied Palestinians. In a similar way, Indian government is basically dealing with its minorities, dealing with its dissent in different different parts of the country. So, to summarize, there is an ideological inclination, there is a closeness between both the regimes, and issues like Pegasus will not have much impact on that.
So Abdul, for the longest time, India maintained a certain distance from Israel, but that distance has been closing. What could possibly explain this closing of the gap between these two countries?
This is true that from 1950 till 1990s, for almost 30-40 years, India did not have a formal diplomatic relationship with Israel, particularly because of the India's commitment towards Palestinian cause. India emerged from the colonial experience, and it had basically expressed solidarity with all the people, all the countries who are facing some kind of colonial occupation. And India had recognized a Palestinian issue as basically a colonial issue. Correct. So because of that ideological commitment to the cause of anti-colonialism, to the cause of Palestinian nationhood, India maintained a distance. This was to some extent a value-based, principle-based foreign policy which Indian government followed before 1990s. But since the neoliberal opening happened, India shifted towards right, and shift towards right simply means that there is as I was talking earlier, there is an ideological affinity between the government in Israel and the government in India. Governments, in fact, successive governments in India, whether it is a Congress government or the BJP government, it hardly makes a difference. Also, India has become very close to United States.
Right.
And Israel and United States are close allies. In that context, India cannot ignore Israel anymore. If it wants to develop and have a working relationship, if it wants to go close to United States of America, it has to go close to Israel as well. So domestic political shift and the shift in the larger global foreign policy inclinations explain the growing closeness between India and Israel. We can see, as I was saying earlier, that the Zionist regime, the ideologies which Zionist regime is based on, and the ideologies which Indian government is following has become very similar. Apart from that, there is an economic urge also. Right. Israel is seen as an important technological society where the technology and science and technology has grown to a level where India sees quote-unquote positive effects if it kind of develops a relationship with Israel. Though this notion may not be true when we examine it in going deep into it, but that is the justification they have provided. The Indian government provides a justification to the masses, to the people in India, that closeness with Israel means advanced technology. Closeness with Israel means advanced weapons. Those weapons which are used by Israeli regime against the Palestinians in the occupied territories. As the activists say, those weapons are tested on the people in Palestine. Those weapons we are buying because and we are trying to justify it as some advanced technological innovation which we are borrowing.
All right, Abdul, thanks a lot for that update. And that's all we have for today. Thank you for watching Daily Debrief. Do come back to us tomorrow and follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. And for more updates and analysis from around the world, visit peoplesdispatch.org.